This is a project up in Gualala on the boundary between Gualala and, or between Mendocino and Sonoma counties, with a small land trust called the Redwood Coast Land Conservancy. And it's called the Mill Bend site. It's a 113-acre site that they recently were able to acquire to protect it for conservation. And so PCI has been working with them to help get grant funding for the project and for developing a conservation plan that will, again, tell them what's on the site, look at the natural resources and other types of resources that are present to help them figure out what they need to do to take care of this site. Where is public access a good idea? Where are sensitive locations that need to be protected? And what are the restoration opportunities on the site? So it's a really beautiful site. It's right on the estuary, where the river meets the ocean here, which makes it a really rich environment ecologically. And it's also just beautiful. It has beautiful views. And because it's right next to the town of Gualala and on the south side, right next to regional parks in Sonoma County, it's super accessible, and people are really excited to have access to this spot. So just before I dive in to describe our work there, just want to note that these are the kinds of partners that fund this kind of work. And so this particular project is funded by the California Natural Resource Agency, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and the Coastal Conservancy. All of those organizations, all those agencies are really excited to fund projects like this that are in the estuary. They have a lot of potential habitat for sensitive species like steelhead and coho salmon, and they're just really important for public access. So those agencies fund that kind of work. And then there's this whole suite of other local groups and state organizations that are involved too. It's definitely a team effort. So when we do a project like this, a conservation plan, we start by, of course, trying to understand the site itself and do a lot of background reading and review, database review. And this site has a lot of history. So it's called Mill Bend because it was the site of multiple lumber mills in this bend in the river. So if you know that area, you know there's lots of forest nearby. There's lots of redwood, lots of Doug fir. There's been lots of lumber activity in the region. And so you can see the site, this was in the 1950s, but it had been active as a lumber mill for a long time already. You can see it was clear cut and, graded flat and very developed and very highly altered at that point. So here is the site now. We're looking north towards the town of Gualala, and most of what you see there on the right side of the river is the preserve. So it's made a lot of recovery, but it's certainly not a pristine environment. So our next step on this project was to go out to the site. Our biologists, our landscape architects, we go out to the site and we visit all the different environments. We look at all the different plant habitats, all the different disturbed areas, and start to record our observations. We start to map things out. We look for areas that are sensitive, areas that might be maybe some of the disturbed areas like that mill site over there could be a good location for public access. We start to catalog what's out there. And here's just a view of the portion that I focused on initially, the plant communities out there. We describe each one of them and look for any rare species that could occur, like in the left-hand photo on the redwood forest. There are a few rare plants in there that we've discovered. And then we're also looking at areas that are problem areas that really could use restoration of some sort. You can see in that willow thickets image that well, the willow thickets themselves are very dense and intact. The sandbar adjacent to them has been highly disturbed by unauthorized folks driving on the sandbar. So we're looking for management issues as well as sensitive resources. Our wildlife biologist goes out there and she's looking for signs of wildlife or their habitat, and also having done background research to give her a sense of what endangered species could be present. We know there are steelhead trout in the estuary. There might be coho salmon. It's unclear. There are red-legged frogs, another threatened species in a little pond on the site. And then there's just lots and lots of common but important wildlife species too. The estuary is amazing habitat for lots of bird life and other species like river otters. There are northern spotted owls nearby, and we know that their favorite prey is the dusky-footed wood rat, and there's tons of wood rat nests around the site. So she looks at all of those things and starts to think about what's most sensitive from a wildlife point of view. Then we come back in the office and we make a lot of maps. We use a lot of GIS in our work. I love maps, so I really enjoy this piece of it. This is just an example of how we might portray the sensitive areas on the site, and this makes it easier for the land trust and the regulating agencies to see, okay, where do they need to stay out of, what really needs special attention. That blue area with the purple circle, for instance, is that pond that supports red-legged frog. So having a visual representation just helps us start to lay out the project. Then, since I'm not just the ecologist on this project, but I'm also the project manager on it, I'm thinking about other types of considerations beyond ecology. So there are these remnant historic features that are present, mostly just traces, but they're still important to have in mind for protection. There's a cemetery, historic cemetery, that needs to be protected on site. And then there are other kinds of site constraints, like the fact that Highway 1 runs right through the middle of this preserve. That poses a challenge, obviously, for public access. We want to have people be able to enjoy both sides of the preserve, but it's not easy to get back and forth. There's no formal crossing right now. So that's another element we're looking at. And another consideration is that there are some disturbed soils from the past mill uses. There could be some contamination. We need to have that in mind when we locate different uses. Still more considerations that we have in mind. Climate change, flooding. So this is in the estuary, adjacent to the estuary. So it's natural that there's flooding on the site. The blue area shows where flooding happens regularly, roughly once a year. But of course, that's likely to increase as climate change proceeds, especially as storm surges become greater. Eventually, as sea level rise continues, that could also be an effect. And then there are other considerations just about site terrain and stability that are important when we're considering trail planning. So once we've got all that figured out, all the existing conditions figured out, we can turn our attention to the future, and we think about the restoration opportunities first of all, because this site really was protected for its ecological values. So we're working right now on plans for restoration of that main mill site, the remaining disturbed area that's got a lot of concrete and asphalt and lots of pampas grass and a whole suite of non-native species. So we're working on restoration plans for that, as well as looking at some of the other high priority upland areas. And then perhaps even more important on this site, we're looking at estuary habitat enhancement. So we're just in the beginning stages of this, but this slide shows some of the types of habitat elements that are important for salmonids that we'd like to see in an estuary. So estuaries are really valuable for young salmonids. It's a transition zone between freshwater and the marine environment, and it's a place where they grow and gain weight. It's best if they have lots of opportunities for feeding and foraging. They need opportunities for cover so they can hide from predatory, from hawks or eagles or other predators. So deep pools with old fallen trees in them are really valuable. Log jams also provide cover, and they can provide respite from high flows. The wetlands that you often find along the estuary, they are really rich in insect life and provide lots of food for fish. So these are the kinds of habitat elements we'd like to see in the estuary, but there's not that much present in this spot. So our geomorphologist and wildlife biologist have looked out there, kayaked around, looking at where are some of those habitat elements. And these orange circles are just marking locations where they found some of those good elements, but there's not a lot. Much of the site is really open, relatively homogeneous and flat, and lacks the cover and the wetland environments that fish really need. So we're starting to think, what could be done out there. On the left is the existing conditions, photos, and on the right are some examples from other salmonid restoration projects. The upper right shows a place where an old side channel was reconnected with the river, and so wetlands could develop and provide that good rearing habitat. And on the lower right, there's a site where they installed big redwood root wads to provide some cover for fish. So those are possible elements that could be part of this project. So then, now that we have all the natural resources, both existing and potential in mind, then we're ready to turn attention to the public access. So we've worked with RCLC to think about their goals for the site. First and foremost, they need to protect the resources. Beyond that, they want to provide opportunities that are varied and really enjoyable for people. They want people to be able to experience the beauty and the ecological values of the site, and they want different ways of doing so, whether it's bird watching, or it's hiking, or it's kayaking, or using a wheelchair to access interesting locations. And the other piece, as I mentioned earlier, there are trails that are part of the California Coastal Trail, both to the north and the south of the site. So to the degree possible, they really like to link up with those. So those are their big goals for public access. So we've taken those. Our landscape architects have worked on coming up with concept designs for a couple of options for meeting those goals. And I am not going to show you all of those concepts. I can point you to them if you're interested afterwards. I'm just going to show you really briefly now, so we have plenty of time for discussion and questions and answers. But just in brief, we've come up with a lighter touch option and a slightly more developed option. All of the options are designed to be really resource sensitive. This image here is just a tiny snippet of the plan. There's too much to show you in full right now. But this one shows, this is the Mill Bend area itself. So that willow wetland area south of the highway. And there's an existing access road that people use for kayak access. But here we're proposing a short boardwalk that would let people explore this willow wetland area a little bit and have a place to sit and watch birds. But just a small boardwalk on an existing disturbed location. And it also shows the bright yellow line is a possible way to connect those California Coastal Trail pieces, but that would be outside of RCLC's property. That would be on Caltrans property. So that would be, it would be with Caltrans. Caltrans would have to lead the way, and that would be a long-term endeavor. It's not something that RCLC can accomplish on their own. So that's the lightest touch option for this area. And then this one shows a little bit more extensive option. So if you can see now, that boardwalk goes all the way up to the upper left corner of the image, and it would go beyond that to connect to the trail to the north. So a boardwalk would go all the way along the west side of the property, and it would link up to the bluff trail to the north. And it would also give people an opportunity to really experience the views and be further away from the highway as they're traveling north-south. So that would be, would have a lot of values from a user perspective, but it would also, it would come relatively close to that pond. It would take a lot more money, and it would have more impact on the willow wetlands, for instance. It would just mean that there was more human presence down in that relatively sensitive estuary environment. So that's just an example of the kinds of options that RCLC is considering, and we're helping them think about. These are the other elements now that we get down to. What are the specific impacts of any given option on the environment? What would they cost to build? What would they cost to take care of over time? How much does any given option rely on landowners outside of RCLC, like Caltrans? How resilient would it be to climate change and flooding? And how good a fit is it with RCLC's capacity? It's a, like I said, it's a small organization. It has one part-time staff person and the rest is all volunteer. So they really need to think about how much they can take on and manage over time. So this is the stage we're in now on this project, helping RCLC think through these alternatives. And we'll be developing a portion of the public access designs further, and then writing up the entire conservation plan over this next 6 or 8 months or so. So that's just one example of our work that I'm really excited about. It's a good illustration of how my work begins with the vegetation, begins with the science, and the science is a theme throughout, but it also is really, really about people and working with people to help them find a way to align their interests and desires for land uses, help them align those with natural systems and natural processes. So it's not easy often, but I find it's a really interesting spot to work. So with that, I think I will stop the slideshow and give you guys a chance to ask some questions.